The bank teller stopped typing. Her screen had frozen on a single page, the cursor no longer blinking. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, then slowly pulled back. The polite smile she'd been using moments earlier faded, replaced by something careful, almost guarded. She looked down again, then up, not at him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This transaction can't be completed right now." The silence that followed pressed in from every direction. Conversations behind us softened. Someone shifted in line. My stepfather let out a short breath through his nose, already irritated. "What do you mean, can't?" he asked. "It's my account." The teller didn't answer immediately. She clicked once more, then angled her monitors slightly away from him. "I just need to verify something," she said. "It shouldn't take long." I already knew it wouldn't be quick. We were there because my tuition deadline was that afternoon. Not tomorrow, not next week, that day. The email from my college had been clear, neutral, automated, final. Funds must be received by 5 p.m. or enrollment will be delayed. I had forwarded it, printed it, left it on the kitchen counter where he sorted his mail every morning. He hadn't commented on it. Instead, he'd told me we'd go to the bank together. His voice had carried that familiar tone, measured, reasonable, almost generous. "Let's handle this properly," he'd said. "I don't want you stressing over money you don't really understand." I hadn't argued. I just picked up my bag and followed him to the car. Inside the bank, he moved ahead of me without hesitation. This was his element: quiet authority, polished counters, people trained to be courteous. He greeted the teller by first name, asked about her weekend, leaned comfortably against the counter like someone who belonged there. "This is about a college fund," he said. "I need to move some money around." He didn't introduce me. I stood beside him, hands folded, eyes lowered. I'd learned that silence made people underestimate you. He called it being respectful. I found it useful. The teller asked for identification. He slid his license across the counter, then added casually, "I'm the account holder." Not an account holder, the account holder. The teller nodded and began typing. Her expression stayed neutral, professional. "And is she authorized to speak on the account?" she asked, glancing briefly in my direction. Before I could respond, he answered, "That won't be necessary." The teller acknowledged him with a small nod and continued typing. "She's going to college out of state," he went on, as if explaining a delay rather than a person. "Expensive one. We agreed I'd release the funds when I felt it made sense." Agreed. I focused on the faint scratch along the edge of the counter, keeping my face still. The teller asked a few routine questions. He answered them easily, confidently, never once turning toward me. To anyone watching, it would have looked efficient, orderly, reasonable. Then she paused, scrolled, paused again. Something shifted, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Her shoulders straightened, her typing slowed. "I'm going to double-check something in our system," she said, standing. "I'll be right back." The moment she stepped away, my stepfather scoffed. "Every time," he muttered. "Banks love to complicate straightforward things." He leaned closer to me, lowering his voice, though the irritation was unmistakable. "You need to understand something. That money isn't something you get to decide about yet. It's family money. I decide how it's handled." I nodded once, like I was listening. Around us, the bank continued its quiet rhythm. Keyboards clicking, receipts printing, a phone ringing softly somewhere behind the counter. No one paid us any attention. No one needed to. When the teller returned, she wasn't alone. A man in a dark blazer stood a few steps behind her, hands loosely folded, observing without expression. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Before she spoke, she glanced at the screen again. "Before we proceed," she said carefully, "I need to confirm the original structure of this account." My stepfather smiled, thin and practiced. "It was set up years ago, very straightforward." She nodded, eyes still on the screen. "That's not exactly what I'm seeing." The word "exactly" settled between us, heavier than it should have been. His smile faded. "What does that mean?" "I'm seeing joint authority listed on the original documents." "That can't be right," he said immediately. I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to remind them I existed. The teller looked at me, not with concern or sympathy, just attention. "Can you please confirm your full name?" I did. She typed it in, the screen refreshed. The man in the blazer leaned forward just enough to see. My stepfather laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "She was a minor when that account was opened. That designation doesn't mean what you think it does." The teller didn't argue. She didn't correct him. "I'll need to review the original paperwork before any funds can be released. Until then, all withdrawals are temporarily paused." Paused. Not denied. Paused. My stepfather turned toward me, irritation no longer concealed. "Did you do something?" he asked. I met his eyes for the first time that day. "No," I said quietly. It wasn't a lie. The teller printed a single page and placed it face down on the counter. "This is a standard compliance hold. Someone will follow up shortly." As we stepped away, my stepfather muttered about inefficiency, about wasted time. He was already rehearsing how he'd reassert control once we left the building. I adjusted the strap of my bag and glanced once at the paper she'd slid across. I didn't read it all. I didn't need to. The first line was enough to tell me why she'd stopped typing. No one spoke right away. The compliance officer didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone of anything. She simply asked the teller to step aside and motioned for both of us to remain at the counter. The people behind us shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The quiet inside the bank suddenly felt heavier, like the air had thickened. My stepfather smiled, the way people do when they assume a delay is temporary. "This is probably just a system check," he said, almost casually. "We've done this before." The compliance officer nodded, already looking at her tablet instead of at him. "It won't take long," she said. "We just need to review a few details." She didn't say whose details. We were asked to move to a small seating area near the glass wall, not a private office, still visible, still public, still controlled. He sat down first. I took the chair beside him. For a few minutes, nothing happened. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and glanced around the bank with practiced ease, as if this was an inconvenience rather than a disruption. When he spoke to me, his voice was low but firm. "You don't need to worry," he said. "These things happen." I didn't respond. That seemed to irritate him more than if I had argued. "You understand this money isn't something you get to decide about yet," he added, not looking at me. "It's handled, like it always has been." The word handled landed exactly where it was meant to. Across the room, the compliance officer spoke quietly with another staff member. I noticed how often they glanced in our direction, not at him, at me. That was new. He noticed it too. When the officer returned, she asked for identification, from both of us. He handed his over immediately, confident, almost eager. When she turned to me, there was a brief pause, just long enough for him to sigh. "She's with me," he said. "This is family money." The officer didn't react. "I still need her ID," she said evenly. I passed it to her without comment. She compared it to her screen, then to a printed sheet clipped inside a thin folder I hadn't seen before. Her expression didn't change, but her posture did. Straighter, more deliberate. "We're going to need a little more time," she said. "There are some authorization details we need to verify." My stepfather let out a short laugh. "It was set up years ago, very straightforward." She nodded once. "That's what we're confirming." He leaned forward now, irritation beginning to replace confidence. "Is there a problem?" I wouldn't call it that, not yet. Those last two words stayed with me. We waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The bank continued around us. Quiet conversations, printers humming, the soft shuffle of people being helped and leaving. We were still seated in the same place, suspended in something undefined. He checked his watch. "This is taking longer than necessary," he said. "I understand. These reviews follow protocol." Protocol. He hated that word. When she left again, his tone changed. "This is why I told you not to come," he said under his breath. "You make things complicated." I met his eyes for the first time since we'd arrived. I didn't say anything. "That's the problem," he snapped. Then, realizing where we were, he lowered his voice again. "Just sit tight." As if I hadn't been doing exactly that. Another staff member approached, older, quieter, with the kind of presence that didn't rush. He introduced himself briefly and sat across from us, placing the folder on his lap. "We're reviewing account structures. Joint access can sometimes trigger additional steps." My stepfather's jaw tightened. "There is no joint access," he said quickly. "This is under my management." The man didn't correct him. He simply opened the folder. From where I sat, I couldn't see the contents. I didn't need to. The shift in the man's expression told me enough. Focused, careful, certain. "We're going to need a little more time," he said after a moment. "We'll be placing a temporary hold." My stepfather let out a short laugh. "A hold?" he repeated. "On what basis?" "Standard review," the man replied calmly. "You'll be contacted once it's complete. That money is allocated. It's already designated." The man looked up at him then. "Yes, that's exactly why we're reviewing it." Silence followed. People were watching now. Not obviously, not openly, but the way people do when something feels off. My stepfather gathered his jacket, movements sharp, controlled only by effort. "This is unnecessary, but fine. Call me when it's done." He turned toward the exit without waiting for me. I stayed seated. The compliance officer looked at me once more before leaving. "We'll be in touch. Please make sure your contact information is current." I nodded. Outside, he stopped abruptly. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," I said truthfully. His eyes searched my face, trying to find something. Guilt, fear, defiance. He found none. "You don't get any ideas," he said. "This doesn't change anything." I watched him walk away. That evening, I received an email from the bank. Brief, formal, carefully worded. It confirmed the hold. It also confirmed something else. Not in detail, not explicitly. Just enough to tell me this wasn't a delay anymore. It was a process. And processes, once started, don't move backward. When we left the bank that afternoon, nothing had changed on paper, but the system had already noticed something we hadn't been told yet. The automatic doors opened. The air outside felt the same. Traffic moved. Phones rang. Life continued. He stepped ahead of me, already scrolling through his screen, irritation settling in the set of his shoulders. Not once did he turn back. Not once did he ask what the teller had seen or why the transaction had paused. The way he walked told me something. Not confidence, but assumption. He assumed delays were temporary. He assumed authority belonged to whoever spoke first. He assumed the system existed to confirm what he already believed. I said nothing. Silence had become my safest position long before that day, and now it was something else entirely. It was space. Space to watch. Space to notice what other people overlooked when they felt secure. Over the next few days, the house returned to its usual rhythm. Meals were planned. Bills were mentioned in passing. Decisions were made without discussion, as if nothing had been interrupted. But there were absences. He never mentioned the bank again. He never asked for clarification. He never followed up. The pause, to him, had been an inconvenience, not a signal. I let it remain that way. Late at night, when the house settled into its quiet patterns, I began opening old files, not aggressively, not obsessively, methodically. Messages that had once been forwarded without comment, account summaries sent for reference, notices labeled informational rather than urgent. I wasn't searching for guilt. I was mapping history. What emerged wasn't a dramatic error or a single reckless decision. It was consistency. The same phrasing repeated across documents created years apart. The same access language. The same classification. Joint. At the time, it probably felt efficient, a way to manage things without complications, a structure built on trust rather than scrutiny. I understood then why no one had ever bothered to revisit it. People rarely re-examine arrangements that favor them. A few days later, I scheduled a brief consultation with an attorney. I didn't frame it as a conflict. I didn't describe it as a dispute. I described it as a review. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, her questions minimal. When I finished, she asked only one thing. Has anyone ever formally removed your access? I told her no. She nodded once and asked me to send copies of what I had. Her response arrived the next morning, measured, precise, calm. She explained the difference between control and ownership and how courts interpret the gap between the two. She explained how authority is often assumed, while entitlement must be documented. She explained that joint access doesn't weaken a structure unless someone misunderstands what it actually means. Then she said something else, almost casually. In situations like this, silence tends to work in favor of the person who's willing to wait. I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. From that point on, I changed nothing outwardly. I didn't confront him. I didn't correct his language. I didn't challenge his assumptions. Instead, I watched more closely. I noticed how he interacted with institutions, confidently, dismissively, as if procedure existed to validate his intent rather than examine it. I noticed how often he summarized instead of reading, how often he said, "That's standard," without checking whether it still applied. One evening, while sorting through mail, he mentioned needing to straighten out some paperwork. The way he said it, casual, vague, told me he still believed the interruption was procedural, not structural. That night, I forwarded one final document to my attorney. Her reply was short. This explains the hesitation. She didn't add anything else. The silence after that line was louder than any explanation. A week later, an envelope arrived, plain, neutral, no warning language, no urgency markers. He opened it at the kitchen counter, scanning quickly at first, then slower. His expression shifted, not to panic, but to confusion. He reread one paragraph twice. Then he folded the letter and placed it face down beside his phone. "Just routine," he said. "They're verifying a few things." I nodded and returned to what I was doing. Inside, the picture was already complete. Verification meant records. Records meant timelines. Timelines meant facts. What he still didn't understand was that the system wasn't asking permission. It was preparing confirmation. From that point forward, the atmosphere in the house changed in subtle ways. His patience shortened, his confidence sharpened into irritation. He checked his email more often, he made calls in lower tones, stepping into other rooms. I heard everything. What struck me most wasn't his concern, it was his certainty. Even now, even with official correspondence involved, he spoke as though the outcome had already been decided. That certainty came from years of never being questioned. He had forgotten that systems don't respond to authority. They respond to documentation. I received my message that same week, a request for availability, neutral language, polite phrasing, a note indicating that a representative would be in touch to clarify several outstanding points. I replied promptly. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I simply confirmed. For the first time since the bank counter, something shifted fully into place. Not relief, not excitement, certainty. Whatever happened next wouldn't depend on tone or confidence or who believed they were in charge. It would depend on what had already been written years earlier when no one thought it would ever matter. And that was exactly why it did. The notification came early in the morning. It wasn't dramatic. No warning sound, no urgent language, just a short message informing me that an action on the account had been paused and required in-person verification. I read it twice, then once more. It didn't say who had initiated the request, but I already knew. The timing was too precise, too familiar. He liked to move quickly once he felt confident, especially when he thought no one was paying attention. I didn't call him. I didn't react. I printed the message, placed it neatly in my folder, and went about my day as if nothing unusual had happened. By the time we arrived at the branch that afternoon, he was already irritated. Not angry, irritated. The kind of impatience that comes from expecting routine compliance and being forced into delay instead. He walked straight to the counter, spoke first, and used the same tone I'd heard so many times before. Polite, firm, expectant. He explained that there had been an interruption during a transfer and that he was there to clear it up. The employee nodded, typed quietly, and then paused, just for a moment. She looked at the screen, then back at him, then down again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary. "I'll need to ask a few questions," she said carefully. He smiled, the kind of smile people use when they believe cooperation is guaranteed. He confirmed his identity, repeated his request, and added that he was on a tight schedule. The employee listened, then stood. "I'm going to bring my supervisor," she said. "It shouldn't take long." That was the first visible shift. He leaned slightly back, surprised but still composed. I stayed where I was, hands folded, eyes lowered. The supervisor arrived with a tablet and a neutral expression. She didn't greet him the way people usually do when they're about to resolve something quickly. She asked for identification again, then mine. That part made him glance at me, just briefly. The supervisor reviewed the screen, then the folder I slid forward without comment. She didn't open it yet. She simply placed her hand on top of it and continued asking procedural questions. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. Not colder, more precise. "There appears to be a discrepancy in how this account has been treated," she said. "Before we proceed, I need to clarify authorization." He corrected her immediately. "There's no discrepancy," he said. "I've handled this account for years." She nodded once. "I understand," she replied. "That's why it was flagged." That word landed differently. Flagged. He shifted in his seat. She turned the tablet slightly, just enough for him to see lines of information, dates, and notes. I didn't lean forward. I already knew what would be there. "The issue isn't activity, it's assumption." Silence settled between them. She finally opened my folder. The documents weren't traumatic, no highlighted sentences, no emphasis, just copies of original setup pages, a clause that hadn't been reviewed in years, and a structure that had been treated casually because no one expected it to be questioned. "This account was never meant to function under a single authority," she said evenly. "Certain actions require acknowledgement from both parties." He frowned. "That's never been a problem before." She met his eyes. "That doesn't change how it was structured." For the first time, his confidence faltered, not collapsed, faltered. He asked if this could be overridden, if an exception could be made, if there was a faster way to complete what he'd started. The supervisor shook her head. "This isn't discretionary, it's procedural." She explained that once the recent request was made, the system reviewed the account automatically. That review triggered a pause. That pause required confirmation, and confirmation required presence, not authority, presence. She turned to me. "Do you acknowledge this request?" she asked. I answered calmly. "No," I said. "I don't." Nothing more. No explanation, no emotion. The supervisor nodded and made a note. Then she explained the next steps, what would remain paused, what would require joint review going forward, what could no longer be initiated unilaterally. Each sentence removed a layer of control he'd assumed was permanent. By the time she finished, his frustration had turned quiet, focused. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was recalculating. As we stood to leave, the supervisor added one final clarification. "Until this is fully reviewed," she said, "no further actions can be made without mutual confirmation." He didn't respond. Outside, he walked ahead of me again, but this time slower. The certainty he'd carried into the building hadn't followed him out, and for the first time since this had begun, I didn't feel like I was waiting anymore. Something had already shifted, not emotionally, not personally, systemically. The email arrived without urgency, without color, without emotion. It confirmed what the branch supervisor had already said in person, but this time it came from a department I hadn't spoken to directly. The message was short, formal, carefully worded. It stated that the account review was complete, that prior actions had been reversed, and that future activity would require acknowledgement from all listed parties. Nothing else. No apology, no explanation. Just confirmation. I read it once, then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't adding meaning that wasn't there. The language was precise, deliberate, final. The funds were secure, access was restructured, control had been corrected. The system had finished its work. I forwarded the message to the registrar's office with a reference number attached. I didn't add a note. I didn't explain the delay or the reason. I attached the confirmation and submitted the payment form exactly as instructed. Within the hour, I received a receipt. The tuition was marked as paid. Seeing that single word on the screen did something I hadn't expected. It didn't feel dramatic or emotional. It felt stabilizing, like something heavy had been set down quietly without anyone announcing it. That evening, there was no confrontation. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't raise his voice or accuse anyone of interference. He moved through the house carefully, as if recalculating distances he thought he knew. At dinner, he spoke about unrelated things, schedules, weather, plans that required agreement but no authority. I listened. I nodded when it made sense to. I didn't correct him when he spoke in generalities instead of specifics. The absence of control had changed his tone. A few days later, another envelope arrived. This one was physical, neutral paper, standard formatting. Inside was a brief notice confirming the same information in print, along with updated access instructions and a summary of account structure going forward. I placed it in a folder with the other documents I had quietly collected over the past months. It fit there easily, like it had always belonged. Nothing else needed to be done. There was no moment where he admitted fault, no conversation where anyone apologized or acknowledged the shift directly. The correction didn't require agreement, it didn't ask for understanding, it simply existed. When he eventually realized that he couldn't move money the way he used to, he didn't say my name. He didn't ask questions he already knew the answers to. He adjusted his behavior instead. That told me everything. Control, once lost, doesn't announce its departure. It just stops responding. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes. Requests were phrased differently. Statements became suggestions. Decisions that once arrived fully formed now came with pauses, as if waiting to see whether they would be accepted. I didn't push back. I didn't assert anything new. I just continued. Classes began, schedules settled, my days filled with ordinary responsibilities that felt lighter than they should have, given how hard they'd been to secure. Every now and then, I'd catch him watching me, not with anger, but with uncertainty, the kind that comes when someone realizes they misunderstood the structure they were standing on. I never corrected that misunderstanding, because the truth was simple. He hadn't lost control because I took it from him. He lost it because he never had it alone. The system didn't respond to confidence or volume. It didn't care how long someone believed something was theirs. It responded to documentation, to definitions, to the way things were actually set up, not the way they were remembered. Silence hadn't been weakness. It had been preparation. Not reacting hadn't been surrender. It had been patience. And when it was time to speak, I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain my reasoning or defend my position. I only needed to acknowledge what was already written. Looking back, the moment that mattered most wasn't the freeze or the review or the confirmation. It was the choice not to argue when arguing would have changed nothing. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It didn't humiliate anyone in return. It arrived on paper, through procedure, exactly the way it always does. Quietly. I closed the folder, placed it where it belonged, and went back to my life. Some things don't need to be taken back. They only need to be recognized.